Welcome to the Fenro Do No Harm introduction video. My name is Michaela Leis. I'm a freelance peace and conflict consultant working with organizations, governments, and civil society on how to do effective peace building and conflict transformation work, and on how to implement projects and programs in the humanitarian, developmental, and peace building fields in a conflict-sensitive manner. Alongside this video, you will find assignments that you can do to apply your new learning. You can either do them once you've completed the video, or you can pause the video as I'm taking you through the Do No Harm framework step by step, and you can implement those assignments as we go through the video. At the end, you will also find a QR code to a self-learning test to test your new knowledge. So the Do No Harm framework was developed as a tool from practitioners for practitioners, or by practitioners for practitioners. The idea was, as organizations were facing larger and larger challenges operating in the world in the early 90s, when with the breakup of the Soviet Union, lots of conflicts escalated into warfare, into escalated levels of violence. And often organizations, even though their intentions were well meant, supporting people on the ground, were actually unintentionally worsening conflict situations, or in extreme cases, their work was actually leading to the eruption of new conflicts. So a group of practitioners got together in the so-called local capacities for peace projects to examine exactly how we can do our work in contexts of escalated violence in a way that doesn't unintentionally worsen the situation. That was the key question of the project. So how can we work in a context where conflict has escalated into violence without unintentionally worsening the situation? The project had several objectives, the first of which was to actually study and do that in a systematic way, the impact of our interventions, so humanitarian, developmental, and also peace building, on situations of violent, destructive conflict, and to identify patterns in how these interactions happen across the world in many different countries, across many different cultural contexts, and so on, in order to then learn lessons for future programming to help organizations check their work and improve their work in order to avoid unintentionally worsening the situation. The result of over 20 years of work on this was the Do No Harm framework as we know it today. And the framework is usually displayed as a table that helps you to visualize the framework. You can do this either in a document on your computer, but I recommend that when you go about applying the Do No Harm framework the first time, that you actually do it on big flip charts so that you can really visualize the results of your work. And as a first step, you would analyze the context of conflict you're working in. So that would be, for example, the geographic location. So are you working in a very local context, let's say in a particular province, or are you working on a national level? You would also specify the different groups that are in conflict in that context. And I recommend that at this stage, you also do a full-fledged conflict analysis where you're looking at the conflict issues, factors for conflict and factors for peace, where you would do an actors mapping, looking at the parties involved, their interests, the relationships among the different parties, and the general conflict dynamics. Unfortunately, we cannot go into this in more detail here, but there are several useful resources to be found on the internet. In the next step, then, you would identify and analyze the dividers. These are the factors that are dividing people and the sources of tension on the ground. In order to help you with this analysis, you can follow several categories. The first of which are the systems and institutions. So how are, for example, political parties or authorities like municipalities and so on, organized in a way that reinforces conflict or that divides people? Important is here to mention that dividers are never people. It's always what they do, how they behave, and how they relate to one another that is the source of tension. So you wouldn't list actors here. You would look at the attitudes and actions of people. So how they think about each other, how they relate to each other, and how they treat each other in a way that reinforces conflict or leads to conflict or increases or leads to divisions. You would look at their values and interests that guide them. You would look at the experiences they have made. And last but not least, you would also look at symbols and occasions that are divisive. Be that national flags, for example, that only represent one group. Be that occasions where, for example, if we had a war that was won by one of the parties, if the last day of the fighting would be labeled as Liberation Day and would henceforth be celebrated, that would obviously be very divisive towards the people who lost in that conflict. The next step would be to analyze the connectors. And here you follow the same categories of systems and institutions, attitudes and actions, values and interests, experiences, symbols and occasions. And this time you would look at, well, which of these are uniting people, so bringing them together. What you usually find is that your dividers list is much longer than the one for connectors, especially if we're looking at really escalated conflict situations. And still, you would always be able to also identify things that connect people across the conflict lines. If you look at their everyday lives, where do people still meet? Where do they get together? Be that in schools, in shared market squares, in shared social institutions, and so on and so forth. When you finalized the analysis of the dividers and connectors, you would then place your project details or program details in the middle column. You would list where your project is being implemented, or if you're at planning stage, where it is to be implemented in the future, when it will be implemented or is being implemented, why. So what are the goals your project or program is trying to achieve? What are the issues it is aiming to address? With whom is it being implemented? So who are the participants? By whom? Who are the implementers? So be that you yourself as an organization or in collaboration with a partner organization and so on. And then how, and this is the how here refers to how you're implementing your project. That would usually be your list of activities and any other information on how you're doing your actual work. The next step then would be to analyze how your project details might be reinforcing or strengthening dividers. And this is usually obviously unintentional. This is not our intention to increase the conflict situation, but sometimes through the way we go about implementing our work or already in the way we planned it, we might reinforce certain dividers and therefore cause harm in the sense of the general harm framework. You would also look at in how far your project details will weaken dividers, and that would be a positive impact. So this is something to then work on and to strengthen. And on the other side, you would look at how your project would increase connectors. Again, that is positive impact that we want to reinforce. And also at how your work might weaken connectors. That would again be negative unintended impact that we want to avoid. So these two arrows guide you to the harm you want to avoid, and the green arrows guide you to things that are going well and that you want to reinforce or strengthen, that you want to do more of. Whereas the red arrows you want to minimize or avoid in as much as possible. The way in which that negative or positive impact usually happens is twofold. It is through the so-called resource transfers, which I'll introduce to you in more detail later. And so this is our action. These are our actions, the way we implement our work and go about our activities. And then also not only through our actions, but also through our behavior. These are the so-called implicit ethical messages, or the RAFT criteria, and RAFT here is standing for respect, accountability, fairness, and transparency. Again, I'll introduce these two categories to you later. These are your reference or your guidelines for how to analyze possible negative impact of your project on the context of dividers and connectors. So weakening dividers or strengthening connectors is the negative impact we want to avoid. Once you identified project details that are potentially causing harm, if you're at planning stage, or if you're at monitoring stage, and you have already implemented parts of your project and you realized some of your project details have caused harm, then in the next step, you would develop options and redesign your project. These options you can write either next to the dividers, if it is an option for a project detail that has strengthened a divider, or you would write it in a column next to your connectors if you're addressing a project detail that will potentially weaken a connector or that has already weakened a connector. Then in the last step, you need to check if your options might also reinforce dividers or weaken connectors. If yes, you need to keep redesigning and testing your options until you find an option that is least likely to cause harm by strengthening dividers or weakening the connectors. If you want to go an extra step, then you can also redesign your project to see how you can reinforce and strengthen connectors in a more active manner and how you can actively weaken dividers. So again, you would develop options, write them in the left or right-hand column, and then test if these options might reinforce your dividers or weaken your connectors. If not, you can go and implement, and if yes, then keep checking for options. Of course, we cannot predict the future completely, and it is not completely in our hands how our project unfolds. So it is about finding options that are least likely to cause harm. I will take you through the steps of application once again. So there are 7 steps to implement the Do No Harm framework. The first is to understand the context of conflict, which we've done. Second step is to analyze the dividers and sources of tension, following those 5 categories I've provided you with earlier. Third is to analyze the connectors and the so-called local capacities of peace that are already existing in the society despite the conflict. Then we analyze and unpack our own project and program. And in the 5th step, we analyze our programs or projects' impact on the context of conflict. So these are the dividers and connectors through resource transfers and implicit ethical messages or RAFT. As a 6th step, we then generate programming options for those details that have or are likely to cause harm. And finally, we test those options and, if necessary, redesign the program again and again until we find options that are least likely to cause harm. I will take you through each of those steps of application again in more detail, and this is where you will also find your assignments. We will start with steps 1 to 4 again. So just to remind you, first you identify the context of conflict, geographic location, the groups involved, and any other details that are helpful for you. This should not be more than a few bulletin points so that you have an overview here. But as I said, you can link that to a deeper conflict analysis or also to deeper context analyses that your organization might have already done or that other organizations have done. You then analyze your dividers according to the categories of systems and institutions, attitudes and actions, values and interests, experiences, and symbols and occasions. And you do the same for your connectors. And then in the 4th step, you list your project or program details. Here is your assignment for this part. So first of all, identify the context of conflict you're working in. Second, analyze the connectors and dividers in your context. So those are steps 2 and 3. And then third, add the details of your project in the middle column, which would be step 4 of the application of the Do No Harm framework, as you have seen in the table on the slide before. We would then progress to step 5. And I already mentioned earlier that there are certain, again, categories or patterns that I can share with you of how our interventions usually impact on the context of conflict. And our project can have negative or positive impact, as I mentioned earlier. So either we increase dividers, that will be negative impact, or we weaken dividers, that will be positive impact. We might be increasing or strengthening connectors, again, positive impact, or weaken connectors, that will be negative impact. And that happens through our actions, the resource transfers, and our behavior, so our conduct, and thus would be through implicit ethical messages and the Raft criteria. We'll go through them one by one before I give you your next assignment. This is all fairly easy to remember. So essentially actions, A, plus behavior, B, has C, consequences. So we need to be mindful of how we do the things we do. And so that will be the behavior. And we need to be mindful of what it is that we're doing when we want to work in a conflict-sensitive way. So on the sides of the actions, we have the so-called resource transfers. Whenever we're working in any kind of context, we bring with us resources, be that financial resources, be that staff, be that material, and so on. So this is the way in which our projects can impact on the context. There are 5 different types of resource transfers. The first of which is always negative, which is theft. So if project resources get diverted to another cause, be that AIDS deliveries being stolen by armed groups, be that project staff using project cars, for example, for private excursions to the beach without paying for fuel and use of the car. So we have a big spectrum of ways in which resources that should be dedicated to the project can get misused for different things. And that would always have a negative impact on the context because you're taking away things that were meant to support the local context. The second type of resource transfer can be positive or negative, and these are the so-called market effects. When we, for example, bring money into a local context, that can strengthen the local economy. If we're buying goods that are to be delivered as part of a humanitarian project, for example, on the local market, that can strengthen the local economy. At the same time, it can also skew prices. If we're buying a lot of a particular item, then prices for that item might rise, especially if there is not enough of it in the local context for our purposes of humanitarian aid and for also the general population to have access to it. And then what happens is that prices are so high that often the local population can't afford to buy these items anymore. Same goes for rent, for example. When organizations are renting office spaces and are renting accommodation for their employees, they usually pay a higher rent than the landlords would get from a local person renting that space as a home. And therefore, sometimes local people are getting kicked out effectively of accommodations so that landlords can rent these same spaces to international organizations at higher rates. Then we have the so-called distributional effects. So the way aid and developmental cooperation as well as peace building are working with certain groups and neglecting others can also have a negative effect. If we're always working with only one group, that might lead to conflict with the other group. We have seen that a lot in the Middle East, where at the onset of the Syrian refugee crisis, projects were targeting mainly the incoming refugees and were completely neglecting the equally vulnerable host communities. And that actually, in some contexts, led to conflicts erupting between those two groups. At the same time, we can obviously use distributional effects also to equalize power asymmetries by working with the weaker group, but not excluding the stronger group already, and by trying to bring them closer together and rebuild relationships. Then we have the so-called legitimization effects, where by working with certain people, we can legitimize them in the eyes of the general population. This can have positive and negative impact. If we're working with so-called rebel groups and we're wanting to access an area where that rebel group is holding power, then we usually can only get access by either directly collaborating with that rebel group or even by paying bribes. And we can imagine that if we're working with an armed rebel group and we're providing those groups with money, that they will likely use that money to continue pursuing warfare, which means the conflict would be escalated. At the same time, sometimes we can't get access without doing that, which would mean people would also suffer, because then no aid and no developmental efforts or peace-building efforts would reach them. At the same time, it can sometimes be useful to use our sway to legitimize certain actors that are working for an improvement of the situation of everyone in an inclusive manner. So strengthening these individuals or groups and legitimizing them through our collaboration with them can have a positive impact on the context. And finally, we have the so-called substitution effects, where organizations are substituting for tasks that should be in the hand of local and national governments, be that, for example, the education sector. This can sometimes be necessary if the government is not able to do that after a war. However, from the start, we need to have an exit strategy and a handover strategy, so that step-by-step local or national authorities are taking over these jobs again. If we don't do that, and we leave because funding is not coming in anymore, or another crisis erupts elsewhere in the world, then this educational sector, as an example, would collapse upon our departure. And also it frees resources of the government. So if the government doesn't have to finance and put staff into the educational sector, again, it is free to use that money to continue pursuing warfare instead. So again, it can have positive effects if we do that in the beginning, if the government is simply not capable of doing its job. However, we always need to, from the start, integrate an exit strategy and need to integrate a plan for handing over to the local and national authorities. Here comes your second assignment, and this would be to identify how your own project is impacting upon dividers and connectors through resource transfers. So depending on whether you're at planning or implementing stage, analyze the potential of a planning stage, impact of your project details on the connectors and dividers through resource transfers. And you mark those details that will or are likely to strengthen if you're at planning stage, or that have already strengthened if you're at implementing stage, dividers or weaken connectors in red, and those that will or are likely to strengthen or have already strengthened connectors and weaken dividers in green. So the last is the positive impact in green and the negative impact in red. We will then look at our own behavior. So the implicit ethical messages that we're sending through the way we conduct ourselves. And there are several types of messages that usually have a hypocritical aspect to them. I will introduce the list to you. So one is different values for different lives. For example, that international staff are usually given higher wages, benefits such as housing and school fees for their children being paid for, whereas the same does not apply to local staff, sends the message of the life of the international is worth more than the lives of the local. Messages around arms and power. We're usually, as international and national organizations, saying we do not want violence to be a legitimate means to deal with conflict, but we want people to communicate with each other and resolve their conflicts through communication and negotiations. So we're saying it is not legitimate for you to use arms to pursue your goals, whatever that be that for the national government to hold power or for a rebel group to take over. At the same time, if we're then using armed guards to implement our own activities or to deliver aid to certain areas, we're saying, well, it is okay for us to use armed force to achieve our own goals. Again, hypocrisy. Disrespect and mistrust. When we're coming into a context, we're usually working towards building trust again, because that is one of the first things that breaks away in a context of conflict. However, when it comes to us in our own work, we often mistrust each other as organizations. We're competing for funding from the same donors or organizations. And we're displaying a huge level of mistrust and disrespect towards each other. So we're not setting a good example. Project workers' impunity is another key issue in which we often send really negative messages to the population that we're working with. So when people in our own organizations are making mistakes or even committing crimes, often they are not being pursued. They're not being, nothing is being done to actually deal with that behavior. On the contrary, it's usually swept under the rug so that no one knows what's happening, so that we don't lose our image. Whereas when we're working in a context of conflict, we usually say, okay, perpetrators of crimes should be tried, and something should be done, or we're working towards reconciliation. But that also includes usually that people commit to what they have done and potentially apologize, whereas we ourselves do not hold ourselves to the same standards. Powerlessness is another such issue. We're expecting that people in the local context we're working with are doing everything they can to improve their own situation. When it comes to our own work, though, and something goes wrong, the first instinct of us is often to say, well, this is not in our hands. We're not responsible for that. We're powerless here. So again, not holding ourselves to the same standards. Belligerence, tensions, and suspicion is usually the behavior of conflict parties towards each other. Sometimes we as project staff or program staff are, however, portraying the same kind of behavior when dealing with armed groups, for example, going into the context then with an armed guard ourselves. So we're sending the message of, hey, we don't trust you, and we're completely suspicious of you. And that behavior in and of itself can lead to increased tensions. And finally, publicity. So the way we talk about our work can also send really negative messages. I'm sure you all are familiar with these aid campaigns, usually around Christmas in the Western world, for example, where we're asking for public donations, where often poor children are being displayed, where often permission is not asked before photos are taken or published, and where we're focusing on all the suffering and the drama, rather than, for example, showing the world what kinds of improvements we've already achieved through our work. So in order to counter all this, we just need to remember 4 things: to treat each other with respect and to offer respect first before expecting it from others. To be accountable for our actions, to take responsibility when we do something wrong, to try and make it better, and to always be aware of the fact that we have the power to change how we're acting every second of the day. To be fair, and fair can mean very different things in many different contexts. So it's always important to understand, what does fairness mean to you, the participants of our work, the population we're working with, and then to adapt to that to a certain degree, and or if we have a different idea of fairness, to then be very transparent about that and explain that, and still come to an understanding whereby we're finding a way that all of us involved, so us as implementers as well as our participants, that they can subscribe to, that we can all subscribe to. And last but not least, transparency. So talking openly about our objectives, about maybe even mistakes that we have made, because that actually leads to credibility, and it shows that we're accountable, that we're standing up for the mistakes we made, and that we're trying to rectify them. So your next assignment would be to identify possible negative implicit ethical messages that you might be sending through your actions or through your behavior, indirectly, and where you could send positive messages taking into consideration the criteria of respect, accountability, fairness, and transparency. So looking at your behavior, the way you are taking actions. We will now look again at step 6 and 7, so the last steps of the application of the Do No Harm framework. So we've already said, once we've identified that our project details might have negative impact by reinforcing dividers or weakening connectors, we need to develop a list of options. So once we have identified that our project details have a negative impact on the context of conflict through strengthening dividers or weakening connectors, we need to develop options for those project details. So how can we do things differently? And then once we've developed these options, in step 7, we need to test them again to check if the options themselves might strengthen dividers or weaken connectors. If yes, you keep redesigning until you find an option that is least likely to do so. And to take it a step further, you can also find options or additional project details to look at how you can intentionally weaken dividers and strengthen connectors to work towards peace. So here comes your next assignment for step number 6 of the Do No Harm Framework's application, options and redesign. So where you have identified negative resource transfers of your project, please redesign the project details to ensure positive resource transfers and implicit ethical messages also. So also looking at your behavior if you can, that will not strengthen dividers and weaken connectors, taking into consideration respect, accountability, fairness, and transparency as well when you're looking at your own conduct. That is the minimum that you would need to do in order not to cause harm. And then to go the extra mile, please identify additional project or program options to directly strengthen connectors and weaken dividers. And we will go right into your next assignment, because then you need to test the options you've come up with and potentially redesign them again if you realize that your options might also weaken connectors or strengthen dividers, so cause harm. Check if any of the options you identified will weaken connectors or strengthen dividers. If yes, redesign again until an option is found that will, most likely, because we can't know and foresee everything in the future, so that will most likely not strengthen dividers or weaken connectors. We will now come towards the end of the presentations. I will introduce to you the lessons learned of several decades now. Well, we're in the third decade actually of applying the Do No Harm framework. And several lessons have been learned through the application and through the development of the tool. And the first is that activities in a situation of conflict always become part of the conflict. So we cannot say that we're just going to deliver some blankets. So we have nothing to do with the context of conflict. We always, and all our interventions will always become a part of the conflict. That cannot be avoided. Second, the context of conflict is always characterized by 2 realities. You will always find dividers and sources of tension, and you will always find connectors and existing local capacities for peace. Third, activities interact with both realities in a positive way, either by strengthening connectors or by weakening dividers. That will be positive. Or in a negative way, by weakening connectors or strengthening dividers. And that is the kind of usual unintentional consequence that you want to avoid. Fourth, resource transfers, as I have introduced to you, are one way in which activities impact on conflict. Implicit ethical messages and drafts, so the way we behave, are another way through which interventions interact with conflict, or rather we as people actually interact with the conflict situation. Sixth, the program's or project's impact is determined by its details. So we really have to go through all of those details, the when, the where, the what, and so on, to see if the project is likely to cause harm or is already causing harm, depending on whether we're applying this at planning, at monitoring, or at evaluation time. And then the last, which is the most positive of them all, is that there are always options. We always have options for how we're conducting ourselves as people, so for how we're behaving. And we always have options for how we're implementing our activities, for how we're designing our projects. Often a lot of harm is caused already at design stage when we're developing criteria, if these are not developed in a participatory manner, not taking into consideration what people on the ground actually need and prioritize, and so on and so forth. So we always have options for doing things differently. Now we will have a quick look at the project cycle. I already mentioned a couple of times when and how you can apply the Do No Harm framework. And ideally, you would start applying it at planning stage. So in the very beginning, when you've drafted your project design, when you've maybe filled in the proposal, when you've done your financial planning and so on, you would apply the Do No Harm framework to your initial project plan. Because then and there already, you would be able to identify certain project details that might cause harm in the future, on the conflict context by strengthening dividers or weakening connectors. So you can already redesign your project at planning stage. So you fill in the Do No Harm framework here. As you go into implementation, you need to track changes in the dividers and connectors to see if you are, through your activities and through the way you're doing your intervention, if you are increasing dividers or weakening connectors. And you continue to do so, obviously, as part of your monitoring. And when you realize here that your project has a negative impact by strengthening dividers or weakening connectors, you can redesign the project details again and again in implementation stage. Now, how often you do that depends on your local context, depends on your project, on the time frame of your project. If you're running a 6-month project, it would probably be advisable to check in every 2 months or so. In longer term projects and programs that run over 2 to 3 years, you can do this quarterly. And especially if the situation changes, so the natural context changes, for example, we have renewed fighting breaking out and so on, then we obviously also need to do it. In evaluation stage, then you again track the changes in the dividers and connectors. You check if that has anything to do with your project. And that is hard to do because often we cannot really say that we and our program exclusively has led to an increase in certain dividers, for examples, but we can see if we contributed to that increase. And if so, then we need to redesign our project yet again. If you're evaluating midterm, then again, you can also make changes to the next phase of your project or program. If you're at final evaluation stage, the idea is to learn then for future projects, and also to share this learning within your organization. So we want to learn for the next phase, or we want to learn for the future here to avoid making the same mistakes again in the future. And naturally, like I've already mentioned, when you're realizing your project is causing harm already in the implementation stage while you're monitoring, you go directly into redesign and learning for the next phase. Now, I would like to invite you to have a quick think about how you can take Do No Harm on board. And I have a couple of guiding questions for you that can help you in thinking about what you can do differently as a person, as an individual working for an organization, but also for your organization as a whole. So when will you apply the Do No Harm framework? Are you currently working on a project that you could apply it to? Are you planning a project that you could apply it to? Can you make sure that the Do No Harm framework will always be applied at design stage of your projects and programs? Who do you need to engage with in your organization? So who else do you need to take on board? Can you communicate this to your line management? If you're in management, can you engage your staff in the application of Do No Harm as a tool for your projects, for all of your projects and programs? How can you engage colleagues in monitoring their conduct according to the RAFT criteria? So how can you make sure for yourself, but also for others, that everyone is treating each other with respect, that we're being accountable, that we're being fair, and that we're being transparent? What policy changes can be made in your organizations to take Do No Harm and conflict sensitivity on board? And last, this is outreach. How can you cooperate or collaborate with other organizations and advocate for the mainstreaming of Do No Harm? So this could be partners, it could be in coordination fora, and so on and so on. Where can you reach out to others to integrate Do No Harm? We're still working on mainstreaming the tool. There are certain donors who already require you to apply the Do No Harm framework to any project proposal you're sending in, and also to ensure that you're using it as part of your monitoring and evaluation. However, it is still not done across the board for every and each program in this world. Here comes your last assignment. Thinking of your organization, what procedures and policies for conflict sensitivity are already in place, and what else can be done to take Do No Harm on board? Develop ideas for how you can mainstream conflict sensitivity in your organizations. What needs to change and who needs to be involved? The following is a list of recommended reading that I'm gonna just introduce to you. There are a couple of very, very useful materials that have been developed by CDA to, again, introduce the Do No Harm framework. I can especially recommend From Principle to Practice. So the first resource you find here, it explains the application of the Do No Harm framework in a lot of detail. There are other resources that I can recommend. You can have a read through this reading list, but there are many, many more documents that you can find online, especially looking at CDA's website. So thank you very much for watching this video. You will find a QR code, as I've mentioned in the beginning already, for a little quiz to test your newly gained knowledge. And I wish you all the best for your work and hope that through applying some of the new learning from this video, you can make a contribution to working in a more conflict-sensitive manner from now on. Thank you.